I'm Michael. I'm going to be covering Module 9, which is going to be Dramatism, which was invented or coined by Kenneth Burke. And he talks about the idea of life being a drama. And essentially, his theory, in my perspective, seems more so reactionary in terms of it discusses how people act out of wants and needs rather than communications. I guess so. To clarify, that means communication seems less about just conveying information, more so about a means of action. So you communicate in order to achieve something or find a goal. So the one thing that I'm going to be covering in this theory is going to be the idea of victimization. So the theory is fairly complex. Burke threw in a lot of different aspects to explain how communication works in the real world. So he had the dramatistic pentad, and he had just a bunch of different factors that he put into this in order to explain how communication works around us. But the idea that I'm going to focus on is victimization, which also relates to another aspect of his theory, which is guilt. And so the idea of guilt is that Burke believed that language set rules for society, and he felt as though language was going to be the downfall of society because of the idea that when you can label what something is not, you can therefore in a way make it inferior. So that is essentially what guilt is, and so victimization is basically how a person can in a way expunge the guilt onto something else. So rather than letting the guilt reside in a person, Burke believed that victimization was a way of pointing a lot of the bad or negative ideas on something else rather than the person. So one way I can relate this back to my personal life might be the idea of sports. Growing up in high school, I played football. So one way, say one year I had a lot of injuries and football wasn't going very well, then the idea of victimization would be me saying, okay, so the reason why I'm not doing well is because of all these injuries that I received, and not maybe because I didn't prepare ahead of time. So communicative, in a communication aspect, when people are trying to speak to others, the idea of victimization is essentially another way that a person can get something out of someone else. So Burke had, like I said, a very reactionary theory. So in a way, it's more so people are doing things in order to achieve things rather than people are simply communicating to communicate. So this idea of victimization is how another means of someone achieving something. So it's a bit of a bleak way of looking at communications, but that's one way I guess I could relate it back to my life. So in conclusion, I think that this theory is very interesting in the way that it looks at how people communicate with others. It seems to be very realist in the sense that there's a balance of power between people, and people are constantly vying for or trying to achieve that power. So the one thing that I covered, which was victimization, just sort of goes to show how Burke felt as though, like I said in the introduction, that life is not like a drama, it is a drama, so that people act out of reasons and self-interests and rather than just communicating to communicate. So it's one interesting theory that can be realized in real life because you can sort of see how people do act out of what their self-interests are. So it's an interesting to look at and something definitely that is very prominent in the real world.